Hello, welcome back to the bunker. Today we're going to take a look at urbanization and the expansion of cities worldwide, and the positives of that, and some of the negative effects of that as well. First, we're going to talk about what is called the urban crisis. The idea of this urban crisis is that cities are growing faster than the infrastructure in the area itself can actually support it. What happens is you get a deterioration of certain services that are necessary. So that's why they call this an urban crisis, because things are breaking down. It looks different in different places, where, as the city expands, people are moving closer together. People try to escape that, and they do move farther outwards. So many times an urban crisis leads to an increase in urban sprawl. So urban sprawl would be the population moving outward away from the city center and expanding outward and outward. And as the city expands outward, and as people flee the cities, the tax base disappears in that area. So there isn't the money necessary to keep up with the massive infrastructure that we see in that area. And so things start to break down. The economy crumbles, unemployment rises, crime increases, vacant buildings increase, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, as that happens, you start to get what's called urban decay or urban blight, which is where it's just kind of things start to crumble, things are not maintained anymore, and they end up looking pretty bad. The image here is the Michigan Railroad Station in downtown Detroit. This is what it looked like in its heyday. If you go there now, this would be the image today, where like the windows are all busted out. Actually, if you've seen the movie Transformers, this is the building that's featured in the end of the movie Transformers, when the character Sam is on the roof with Megatron. He's actually running through this building, and it looks like an old rundown building because that's exactly what it is. Now, recently it has been purchased, I believe, by the Ford Motor Company, and they are actually trying to restore the building back to its former glory. But when we talk about urban blight, urban sprawl, the Detroit area really is almost the poster child for this. Detroit still has the huge buildings, but there has been a massive amount of flight from the city, a massive amount of sprawl from the city, and that has led to a lot of, rundown vacant lots, vacant buildings, a lot of urban decay in that area. What this map is showing you is, when we talk about a sustainability rating, is, what is their ability to maintain what they're doing, and move forward with the demographics that they have, as well as, their infrastructure and supporting the infrastructure. And this is showing like what the icons are, like the people, the planet, and like the profit. Now, if we go back on the Detroit area, like we have the people, and we are making progress on our environmental impact, but like the money as far as infrastructure development just isn't, needs improvement. It isn't really there right now as far as the ease of doing business and tourism and connectivity. There's a lot of nice districts in Detroit. They're just all separate from each other. So it's what happens in between those districts that becomes an issue. So if we look at this and how we got to this point, as far as the United States goes, up till 1800, we were mainly agrarian. Anytime we talk about anything that's agrarian, that's farming. Right? Most people lived out in the countryside, in rural areas where they were pretty spread out. Starting around 1800, and between 1800 and 2008, the number of people that were living in an urban setting, so the number of people living in city areas that were close together, increased quite a bit, 5% to 79%. So the question is why? There is a mass migration from rural areas, from these farming areas, to large central cities, where now 75% of the American population lives in a city with at least 50,000 people. many people then have migrated from large central cities out to suburbs and smaller cities. So the Industrial Revolution happens, machines make farming easier, which means there are fewer people needed to work on the farm. So people start migrating towards the cities, which is where they're building these machines, which is where the jobs are. And so most people start moving into the cities. As the cities become more crowded and some people become more wealthy, they start moving outward from that inner city center into the surrounding area, the area surrounding it. So suburbs, and start forming suburbs and smaller cities, right? And as they move farther and farther outwards. And if you look in a lot of suburb areas, certain areas, they seem kind of like they could have been vacation home type things. Well, they used to be. All right, where we live outside Detroit, that was where people 50, 60, 70 years ago went on vacation. And so the urban area has spread out, right? Half of Americans that live in cities actually live in suburbs now. We've moved farther and farther away from that city center, right? Most of the population, actually most of the U.S. population since the 80s has occurred in the Southwest. Right? People are leaving in the Northeast and they're moving southwest. And now many people are actually just trying to get as far away from people as possible. And they've fled both the cities and the suburbs and are getting back out into developed rural areas, which is actually increasing the spread of sprawl and increasing the impact of cities away from the central urban center. Take a look at this video. It talks about how urbanization has changed and where this is heading in the future.
Today, more than half of all people in the world live in an urban area. By mid-century, this will increase to 70%. But as recently as 100 years ago, only 2 out of 10 people lived in a city, and before that, it was even less. How have we reached such a high degree of urbanization, and what does it mean for our future? In the earliest days of human history, humans were hunter-gatherers, often moving from place to place in search of food. But about 10,000 years ago, our ancestors began to learn the secrets of selective breeding and early agricultural techniques. For the first time, people could raise food rather than search for it, and this led to the development of semi-permanent villages for the first time in history. Why only semi-permanent, you might ask? Well, at first the villages still had to relocate every few years as the soil became depleted. It was only with the advent of techniques like irrigation and soil tilling about 5,000 years ago that people could rely on a steady and long-term supply of food, making permanent settlements possible. And with the food surpluses that these techniques produced, it was no longer necessary for everyone to farm. This allowed the development of other specialized trades and, by extension, cities. With cities now producing surplus food as well as tools, crafts, and other goods, there was now the possibility of commerce and interaction over longer distances. And as trade flourished, so did technologies that facilitated it, like carts, ships, roads, and ports. Of course, these things required even more labor to build and maintain, so more people were drawn from the countryside to the cities as more jobs and opportunities became available. If you think modern cities are overcrowded, you may be surprised to learn that some cities in 2000 BC had population densities nearly twice as high as that of Shanghai or Calcutta. One reason for this was that transportation was not widely available, so everything had to be within walking distance, including the few sources of clean water that existed then. And the land area of the city was further restricted by the need for walls to defend against attacks. The Roman Empire was able to develop infrastructure to overcome these limitations. But other than that, modern cities as we know them didn't really get their start until the Industrial Revolution, when new technology deployed on a mass scale allowed cities to expand and integrate further, establishing police, fire, and sanitation departments, as well as road networks and later electricity distribution. So what is the future of cities? Global population is currently more than 7 billion and is predicted to top out around 10 billion. Most of this growth will occur in the urban areas of the world's poorest countries. So how will cities need to change to accommodate this growth? First, the world will need to seek ways to provide adequate food, sanitation, and education for all people. Second, growth will need to happen in a way that does not damage the land that provides us with the goods and services that support the human population. Food production might move to vertical farms and skyscrapers, rooftop gardens, or vacant lots in city centers, while power will increasingly come from multiple sources of renewable energy. Instead of single-family homes, more residences will be built vertically. We may see buildings that contain everything that people need for their daily life, as well as smaller, self-sufficient cities focused on local and sustainable production. The future of cities is diverse, malleable, and creative, no longer built around a single industry, but reflecting an increasingly connected and global world.
Okay. Let's give you an idea in the U.S. as far as where population centers are. These big purple dots are areas that have over 10 million people. The New York area is actually one of the largest areas in the world, probably one of the top 10 most populated areas in the world. So we have three probably that we consider mega cities, mega areas, all right, with New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Several that have a little bit fewer than that, but for the most part, most of the American population is centralized in these areas with these dots, and that a lot of it comes from where were the jobs, and where were jobs centralized, and you can see that they were mostly in these areas as our country moved from being mainly farmers to more industrialized. This gives you the same idea. You can see these orange, these shaded areas in here are where you're finding most of the populations. And like this where the other map didn't necessarily show it, this definitely shows like the size of suburban areas and the size of sprawl. So, since 1920, the conditions in urban areas have gotten better. All right, in the urban environments, most people have better living conditions, much better working conditions. Air quality has improved for a while, for a very long time. These industries and cities were venting out these toxic fumes, which were destroying air quality. They also were destroying water quality, and with the EPA and with the Clean Air and Water Acts, that has definitely increased. And for a long time, yes, most people lived in cities, but that was where you were the least healthy. And what has happened is death rates have dropped because there's been better sanitation and better taking care of water supplies and better access to healthcare and things like that inside of cities. Plus, as people moved to cities, there were fewer people out in the countryside, so that actually saw an increase in biodiversity in those areas, which is also good. But as cities grow, cities are growing at rates that are faster than the infrastructure can handle it. Infrastructure is all the things needed to support an urban area. All right, streets, bridges, schools, fire, police, sewer pipes, water supplies, electrical wires. All of those things are necessary to support an urban area and the people that live there. Or if we think of in Michigan, the roads. We're always complaining about the roads. Our governor wants to fix the roads, and there's the constant potholes, and that has to do with the constant freeze and thaw that we see a lot here in Michigan. But it's not just the roads, it's the bridges, it's the sewer pipes emptying in the waterways, those types of things. The electrical system is also an issue as well, as far as those electrical wires. These are all things that need improvements. And, there's a study 10 years ago that the U.S. is $1.5 trillion behind in maintaining infrastructure. We just keep letting it go. And every government, every administration is like, we're going to do infrastructure. And, things happen and that gets put by the wayside. And there is rising poverty in inner cities as well, those city centers, as well as jobs are moved overseas, jobs are moved out of cities into other areas where the tax rate is more favorable for those companies. If we look at the roads in general, road quality does drop. They'll repave a road and the condition of the road starts dropping immediately. Even in the first 10 years, right? And those types of things. And when you come to, if we look at Michigan and how much we spend on our roads, it's really not much. Like, we don't spend a lot of money per person on roads. And that leads to the decay that we are seeing in our area, in our roads. So half of the world's population lives in cities. All right, urbanization is the creation and growth of urban areas and the surrounding land around there. Right? It's measured as a percentage of people that live in urban areas. So if we go like over time, 1900, 2 out of every 10 people lived in an urban area. All right, we go 2010, 2020 right now, about 5 to 6 out of every 10 people live in urban areas. So that's almost 60% of people live in an urban area. All right, the growth then of that is the urban growth is just the rate of increase in urban areas. That can happen color-wise. It could be natural increase. People move there and they start having children. All right, people are pulled to urban areas and search for jobs. There's housing, maybe better access to education. Maybe people are moving to cities to get away from a conflict or to get away from something else. But in general, since that's where most people are concentrated, that's where many of the jobs are concentrated, and that's going to lure people there. There are also governments that favor people living in an urban setting rather than out in a rural setting. And that is leading to this increase that we are seeing over time of finding the world's population living mostly in cities. This shows more of the same thing as far as the urban population on the rise and the rural population declining. What that ends up looking like is this would be a satellite image of the Earth from space during the day. At night, it looks a little bit different. All right, all of these yellow dots are cities. All right, they're all the lights that are going on in the cities, and this is one of these things that you can see floating above space and International Space Station. All right, we've mentioned sprawl before. It is an uncontrolled growth of the cities outward into the countryside. It tends to, as you move outwards, all right, it eliminates agricultural wildlands. The way this happened in the U.S., and we'll refer back to Detroit again. That's the area that we're in, and this GIF really kind of shows it as far as population density spreading outward from. This is where downtown Detroit is in 1940, and spreading outward from there as far as like the number of homes per acre in that area. So sprawl really kind of starts around 1920 as people start moving outward into these areas where it used to be vacation areas. And there's a lot of land out there to expand out to. So as people started to get the money for it, they started we want to have our own little patch of land with our own home on that patch of land. Is the whole idea of the American dream being, the home with the 2.5 kids and the white picket fence type of thing. So after World War II, there was a stimulus for veterans that were coming out. There was a federal loan that guaranteed new housing for World War II vets. And so it led to this rush to build these houses. Also at this time, the government had built highways during World War II, like I-94, runs from Detroit to Chicago, was built with the purpose of taking the bombers that were being built at Willow Run Airport and delivering them to Chicago, where they could then be moved to other places that were needed for the war effort. And they built Interstate 94 for that purpose. As time went on, they found that interstate highways were actually very useful for moving many things very quickly. And so the federal highway system was born and was greatly expanded during that period of time. Plus, gas was very cheap, so it was very easy for people to get out of the city. New tax laws encouraged owning a home, and most zoning laws said, hey, get as big a piece of land as you want and throw a house on it. And the zoning laws also said, you can have commercial areas in one spot and residential areas in another. This is why you see very few stores inside residential areas, because most zoning laws prohibit a mixing of residential, industrial, and commercial zoning. So you have a neighborhood with no stores, and then you have a commercial area with businesses in it. All of these things are going to combine together to basically promote, get out of the city, get a piece of land, get a house for cheap. It's easy to drive around. And once they added these highway systems, it became easier for people to get to places, like live in one place and drive to work in another place. So many people started to live outside of the city, but would drive into the city to work. I know, like me personally, we did not live inside Detroit, but my dad did work inside Detroit for a very, very long time, and would have to drive downtown for work all the time. This gives you an idea that this is Vegas. Everything red would be these developed areas, and I mean, this is over a 30, 40-year time span that starts in 1975. All right, so many cities did start in Vegas. They're sprawling out into the desert, but there were technologies and advancements made that allowed things like this to happen. So when you move out into the countryside, there's a lot of different impacts. There's a loss of cropland, there's a loss of forest and grassland, just in general, loss of habitat or an increase in habitat fragmentation. There's more use of the water that is there, more use of the surface water, more use of the groundwater. But anytime you replace natural areas and replace them with concrete, you're going to see increased runoff. There is much less, and it kind of talks about it right here, there's much less infiltration of water into the ground. There's much more runoff, which increases pollution, it increases flooding, it increases a loss of recharge. All right, so there's not as much groundwater, which becomes an issue. And then that also affects the habitats of animals that live there. As people are driving more, there's a much bigger impact on energy use, a much bigger impact on waste, a much bigger impact on air pollution, and it just increased greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. As people are moving out of cities, people are not frequenting downtown businesses as much, so there's a decline in business downtown, which hurts the economy of that urban center, and furthers the urban sprawl issue as people are trying to get away from jobs like that. And I threw this picture up here because you see more interactions between humans and wildlife. I threw this picture up here because I took this picture out of my kitchen. Where I live, there are deer all the time through our neighborhood. And people are reporting now, as we've been seeing more and more deer, that people are actually starting to report that they're seeing coyotes roaming. With everyone having a Ring doorbell, coyotes are actually walking up on people's front porches now. And so it's picking them up on that camera. So urbanization isn't necessarily all bad. All right, city centers are centers of development, economic development, innovation, education, jobs, all those types of things. This is where everything is happening. All right, people who live in cities have better access to healthcare. They live longer. There are lower birth rates. Generally, improved healthcare leads to lower birth rates, and lower infant mortality rates as well. Usually, though, it's the people that can afford to take advantage of those things that take advantage of them the most. So those benefits usually are greater for the rich than the poor. But there are other things, like environmentally, recycling is much easier to do in a city, all right, than it is out in the countryside. There are more recyclable materials. It's more profitable for the companies that are doing the recycling. If more people are focused in one area, then the more rural areas and the more natural areas are able to continue to exist, and that increases their biodiversity, which is also good. And then cities that rely on mass transit are going to see savings in energy. They're going to see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which is good all around with that as well. There are some cities like New York which rely hugely on mass transit And there's people there that like live in Manhattan that just never own a car. They get anywhere they need to get on the subway or walk or things like that. Whereas where we are in the Detroit area, we drive everywhere. I'm guilty of this too, as it's a 20 to 30 minute drive for me every day to work, which doesn't seem like much to me, but talking to somebody else who might live in a city where they've got mass transit and they can get to places a lot easier, like that just seems crazy to them. So some disadvantages of urbanization. People live in urban areas. There's a massive environmental ecologic footprint. Right, they use 75% of the Earth's resources. All right, although urban areas are only occupying 2% of the land area, which is insane. Now, to support that and to support people that live there, we are disturbing massive amounts of land. You're creating an artificial ecosystem that, like, people who live there don't actually see nature, don't understand real nature, and just really lots of times just don't care about it. They get a specific worldview based on that spot that they live in, which may seem humongous to them and might seem like their entire world, but there is an entire world outside of there. But when you don't ever really see real nature outside of like, oh, there's a park with some birds, it's hard to get an appreciation for that type of thing. It's part of the issues with ocean pollution or with climate change is people are not necessarily experiencing that firsthand, and so it's hard to be passionate about something that you never actually see. You just have to see in the news or YouTube videos or whatever. Urban areas have really very little vegetation. Right? Anytime you replace vegetation with concrete, all right, there's things that come along with that. All right, cement and concrete it releases greenhouse gases. It paves over land. It reduces infiltration, so it increases runoff. It decreases filtration of pollutants, things like that. So, and when you take the vegetation away, they can't absorb the pollutants. They can't reduce the flooding. They can't help recharge. They're not there to give off oxygen through photosynthesis. Trees are going to provide shade for people. They actually block noise. They kind of are like a noise block, so they reduce noise pollution. They provide climate regulation through transpiration, and releasing oxygen does actually help regulate the air in that thing. But a quote that I thought was pretty poignant there says most cities are places where they cut down most of the trees and then name the streets after them. And that's very true. Like I've seen cities where there's not a single tree, but the road is called Pine. Or areas like in Oakland, California, where there are very few oaks. Those types of things. And then the last part of that would be just the water demand. More people in an area means you need more water, and you have to find water somehow. And that usually means diverting water from other natural areas to feed the city, which is a problem. And then in other areas, infrastructure just can't sustain the demand for water, and that leads to maybe ill-advised changes in the water supply. Best example of that was what happened in Flint, Michigan, where the state strongly urged that the city switch to the Flint River, which was very, very polluted and filled with lead from surrounding industry, and ended up poisoning an entire city. When we talk about that, this is the amount of lead, or the amount of, in this case, toxic waste, or how toxic the water happened to be. When you give, like the EPA says, 5 parts per billion is, lead is a problem. All right, the Flint River water that was being recorded at one point in time was, it was pretty much toxic waste, and they were delivering this to homes inside of Flint. All right, in a reading of there was 270 homes in Flint tested 27 parts per billion. That's more than 5 times EPA's like safe limit for that. Take a look at the other thing with this is what happens with the water. Like in a more natural area versus like an urban area. Um, Urban areas have much less evaporation, which actually reduces the amount of water in the air, but everything is runoff. So water is not soaking into the ground. It just runs. They have to find cities have to find something to do with that water when it rains. Right, when it rains in a more natural setting, a lot of that water gets soaked up by the ground and soaks into the ground, so there's not as much runoff. In a city, when it rains, that water needs some place to go, so they need some sort of massive sewer system to support that. All right, other disadvantages. They are concentrating pollution. They're concentrating health problems. You know, in cities, asthma rates are 75% higher than they are in surrounding rural areas, actually, because of especially like particulates that are in the air. The particulates are much higher levels in the air in city centers, in city areas than they are in more rural or natural areas, like that. And this has to do with the high population density, the resource consumption, you know, using most of the world's water and producing most of the world's air and water pollution. Actually, there's a lot of hazardous waste and things like that. All those cars driving around, or if you look, here, all these cars are all packed in on this road, are all emitting car exhaust, and this is creating this gross-looking air in that area. And there's massive disruption to Earth cycles in that. With that, we've seen with the recent quarantine of everybody that they've seen these pollution rates have gone down, where like you're not seeing these massively packed roads anymore, and so you're not seeing the emissions, and people are getting an idea of what it would look like if there was not as much air pollution. Whereas like people in India are able to see the Himalayas for the first time in 50 years. People in LA are seeing blue skies for the first time in a long time. And hopefully this is going to be something that, once we get through this COVID-19 outbreak, that this will be something that people will see and say, hey, we liked it when we saw less pollution, and we want to move forward with that. All right. Noise pollution is a major issue. If you've ever been downtown to a big city, it's loud, right? Noise pollution, it says any unwanted, disturbing, or harmful sound that impairs or interferes with hearing, causes stress and accidents, or hampers concentration. Sounds hurt at 85 decibels, or hurt around 120 decibels, but they start actually damaging your ears at 85, which that's a major problem. This is 1 in 8 kids and teens in the U.S. have some hearing loss from listening to music too loud. I am guilty of that. I think we all listen. We shove our earbuds in, we turn them way up, and it's very loud, and that actually it increases your stress levels. I, for one, like to listen to music to help wind down, but when you're listening it too loud, it actually does affect you physically. And people in cities they have no way out of that, where like there's a constant hum that happens. That is at a level that is pretty close to that 85 decibels in some places. As far as light pollution is more, it can throw people off because we have our natural cycles, but light pollution affects animals probably a lot more, like sea turtles. Sea turtles come on shore and they lay their eggs. When the babies hatch, all right, they head towards out to sea because they see the stars and they see those lights, and so they move out to sea because it is their natural instinct to go towards that light. But now with the cities having moved so close to this ocean side, the baby sea turtles hatch and they see the lights in the city, and they actually move to the city, and so they move inwards instead of out to sea. And because they don't go out to the water, they end up dying. And this is leading to a huge reduction in fertility rates in sea turtles, or how many sea turtles survive, and this is leading to a reduction in their population. The other thing with light pollution is, migratory birds see the lights, they get lured off course by that, and there's all sorts of collisions with buildings that will occur as people leave buildings, like office buildings at night, and they leave the lights on, and that disrupts these flight patterns of birds as well. This is just give you an idea of overall impacts or effects of noise pollution. In cities, horns become serious issues, or just the hum of engines of people driving around, and just the sound in general. All right. Other disadvantages with urbanization is the differing climate. Cities are overall warmer, foggier, and cloudier, um, and generate a lot of heat. Light bulbs generate heat. People generate heat. Factories, cars, they all generate heat. Plus, roads and cement and asphalt and darker things tend to absorb heat a lot faster. Story I like to tell was there was a plane crash in Dallas. It was like 40 years ago, and during the day in Dallas, it had been over 100 degrees. And the plane crashed at night. They were pulling the victims out and putting them in the body bags, and they had laid them out on the tarmac. Well, since it had been 100 plus degrees, the tarmac during the day, the tarmac was still super hot, and they found that they were laying the deceased people, the dead people, out in the body bags out in the tarmac, and they were starting to cook inside the bags because the tarmac was still so hot from the day's heat. And cement tends to heat up quite a bit and store that heat and hold it for a very long time. And because of that, areas that have a lot of cement, and especially like cities, create what are called an urban heat island. The idea of a heat island is you have one warm area surrounded by much cooler areas. And generally, that urban area ends up being much, much warmer, whereas the rural and suburban areas end up being much cooler. That changes overall climate in an area. It can increase the amount of smog. It can increase the need for like air conditioners, which would increase the use of fossil fuels, and things like that. But overall, it has a pretty large effect on the climate of a certain region, because of all that slow release of heat by the cement and the asphalt in cities. All right, so we're going to end this with a case study. Mexico City is the second most populated city in the world. There's 19 million people. They have a lot of issues there. There's massive air pollution. There's massive amounts of unemployment. It is incredibly loud, like to the point where people who live in the city, in the inner city of that, tend to see a reduction in hearing because of the noise, and the overcrowding and the soaring crime rates. And when you look at that, like there's 3 million people that just they don't have the infrastructure. So there's 3 million people that have no sewer access. So there's just a lot of human waste that flows through the gutters and open sewers that are there. And there's sometimes where you get a windy day and it picks up some of the dry stuff and it gets flying in the air, and they get something that's known as fecal snow. So it snows poop, which is awful. This gives you an image of, this would be Mexico City. This is the smog, all right, that is in there. And that smog and all of that air pollution is being breathed in by the people that live there. And so being at a higher elevation and with the higher amounts of sunlight, there's a bad air pollution that's just made worse, with the photochemical smog that happens. And breathing the air there is like smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. It is not good for your lungs. So they have serious issues inside that very, very overpopulated city. All right, that takes care of urbanization. I hope everyone is doing well, and I hope you have a great day.